I collected these data using participatory research methods by working with 24 organizations and individuals across those 12 countries. It was an online and convenient sampling, so it's of course not nationally representative because we don't have population estimates on the community. We can really only do good surveys at this moment in time, and it was an online survey. Actually, it was 2 online surveys. That was a quantitative portion. There was a qualitative portion, which was interviews, in-depth interviews with 24 business leaders on LGBTQ+ issues. That's the regional data set. For this Belizean diagnostic, again, on that link, we really focus on the data from one survey in Belize. And you see here that that was 560 respondents. I don't know if anyone can read that chart to the right. If you can, you have greater eyes than I do. But I will say that we asked ethnicity, education, income, gender identity, sexual orientation. And what we got was a very good diversity of respondents, right? By every category that you see up there. And just to give you an example, when you have that diversity of respondents, that really allows you to do good in-depth regression analysis later on, multivariate, bivariate analyses. So it really allows us to explore a lot of the relationships between variables. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that what you'll see up here is that we have, of course, LGBTQ respondents. We also have non-LGBTQ+ respondents, straight and heterosexual people, heterosexual and cisgender people, right? And at first we were like, well, what do we do with that? What we do with that is we provide really strong comparisons between the LGBTQ+ sample and the non-LGBTQ+ sample, and we see the differentials. And so let's go into that, and I'll go to the next slide. The research itself focused on 8 dimensions, 8 themes, right? And that was challenges within the family, within education, within healthcare, the labor market. The 5th is housing, socioeconomic status, violence, and access to justice. And what we see is that for LGBTQ+ respondents, they face critical challenges throughout the lifetime. And actually, as you see in this box on the bottom right, compared to the non-LGBTQ+ sample, they experience more challenges and harsher impacts according to every 8 dimension, every 8 theme. I go into two of those themes right now, family and the labor market. And what we, again, sorry if you can't see it, it's better on the report itself, but what we see is that we ask about how I have experienced discrimination or exclusion from my family. And what we do is we disaggregate by LGBTQ to the far left, we disaggregate by trans respondents in the middle, and then the heterosexual and cisgender, right? And what we see at the top is that there's significantly more LGBTQ people who experience exclusion or challenges in the family, and even more for the trans sample, right? And this is much more than the heterosexual cisgender sample. So when we say, as a result of this, what is the impact? And what we see is very harsh impacts on the bottom. So we see, of course, more experiencing shame as a result of interacting with their family members due to their sexual orientation, gender identity, which is a little bit more mental health, but we also see much more socioeconomic dimensions too. They're deprived of financial resources, that's family wealth. They're kicked out of the house. So again, it just kind of shows that there's the mental health component, but there's a socioeconomic component as well. And actually for us, we took it a step further and we said that because they fare worse in 8 dimensions, that what we see is that this is called an LGBTQ+ tax and an LGBTQ+ penalty. So what do we mean by tax? If you're expected to cope with more stigma, with more experiences of discrimination, with more challenges, that's quite taxing, right? Every day there's a tax involved, and that can be exhausting. And when you try to look at the impact of that, this is what we call the LGBTQ+ penalty. The impact is there, right? Again, it comes down to diminished mental health. It comes down to socioeconomic challenges. So for us, when we do this comparison between the two, what we see is we really call this LGBTQ+ tax and penalty. It's a framing to understand, again, the complex issues. So for the sake of time, I'll go quickly through labor, but again, yes, what we do see is that LGBTQ and trans people experience discrimination more at work and when applying for a job, more so than the straight and heterosexual sample. And of course, the impacts are much more severe, being more likely to be fired, less likely to access benefits that they should be able to benefit. I was barred from working with clients, stuff like that. You see that, again, there's this huge labor impact as well. All right, so this kind of tees up the next slide, but I just really wanted to show that the experiences of violence, particularly physical and psychological violence, are pretty severe for our sample. What we see is that on account of my sexual orientation or gender identity, more than 1 in 3 had experienced psychological violence, and close to 1 in 5 experienced physical violence. So that's quite a challenge, right? And again, that's a little bit more of summary statistics, descriptive statistics. Now we can get into a little bit more of the exploring the relationships between these variables. What do they say about each other, right? And this is what we call bivariate analysis, multivariate analysis, regression analysis. We're really looking at that relationship. And then we had these 3 questions for it. First, what is the relationship between socioeconomic status and various forms of violence? Is there one? Second, what is the relationship between different types of violence? And the third, to what extent do LGBTQ plus people experience discrimination in those 8 dimensions? And what are their separate impacts on their experience of violence? So really, what is the relationship between discrimination and violence, right? Important questions to ask of the community. So here we go into the first and second. This is the correlation matrix. But what we do see is that absolutely, yes. For those with a lower socioeconomic status, they are much more likely to experience psychological violence. And the flip side is true. For those with higher socioeconomic status, they experience significantly less psychological violence. And this maybe seems intuitive, yes. Like, we know this actually from gender-based violence literature of women, right? What we see is that income and socioeconomic status acts as a buffer against forms of violence. But it's really important to capture this for LGBTQ plus people in a quantitative way, because it's one of the first times, for sure in Belize, but also just around the world. We need to have the facts. We need to be able to put this down in front of the government and say, there is this relationship and it can't be denied. So that's the first question, yes. And you see that when you're looking at socioeconomic status and going down to psychological violence. I can't reach and I don't have a clicker, sorry. But what you also see, for anyone who can read that and can read the correlation matrix, is that there are, of course, relationships between various types of violence, right? So, for example, psychological violence is related to sexually motivated violence. So the more psychological violence you experience, the more sexually motivated violence you feel. That's one example. Another is even stronger relationship. Psychological violence is related to neglect, right? So there's all these examples of how different forms of violence influence each other. It almost suggests a cascading effect of violence. And then finally, a multivariate analysis shows us really what is the relationship between experience of discrimination and types of violence. So again, if I'm saying too much, please just jump in with any questions, because you never know how much you're saying when it comes to data, so feel free to jump in with any questions. But what we do see here is that, again, psychological violence was the first most experienced form of violence, and what we see is that absolutely, a lower socioeconomic status and different types of discrimination are very reliable indicators of psychological violence. So, of course, we have SES on top, we have general discrimination, familial discrimination, housing discrimination. All of these can predict the experience of psychological violence throughout the lifetime, right? This relationship is also there for physical violence, which is the second most experienced form of violence from the sample. And here we see is 4 forms of discrimination are reliable indicators of this physical violence: general discrimination, familial discrimination, professional discrimination, healthcare discrimination. The pattern is the same for neglect as a form of violence. We see 3 reliable indicators as of discrimination, kind of showing the link to neglect as a form of violence. And the last is the same as for sexual violence. We see general discrimination, familial discrimination, healthcare discrimination being reliable indicators of sexual violence. So again, this really shows us that, if you experience discrimination, if you experience violence, it doesn't just stay with you in that moment. It has like these ripple effects throughout the lifetime. There are all these complex relationships that are at play for LGBTQ plus people. For the sake of time, I'm just going to skip this, but it's a summary to say that what we see is that general discrimination and familial discrimination are consistently significant predicators. Seems like a lot, but we divide it by those 8 themes, by those 8 sectors that are explored in the data. We're really trying to focus on the government, of course, and that's 47 recommendations to them based on the data that we find. We're also trying to target businesses, civil society, to really understand this through socioeconomic and economic lens. Economic development, so we have the Caribbean Development Bank, we have the World Bank, we have the Inter-American Development Bank, representing billions of dollars, none of which go to LGBTQ plus people in this country, the region, or barely around the world. And we need them to really look at the data and say, how do we invest in inclusive development in much more meaningful ways? And then how do we develop more data collection down the line?